Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and tonight we have retro sci-fi and horror cinema with Brian Walker. Brian, greetings and salutations. How are you, my friend?
I'm well tonight, Hercules. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, and I love your choice in topics. So I'll be listening, what do you call it, enwrapped in attention, and occasionally throwing out a comment or two. But this is a great topic.
It is, and we're going to be talking about sort of a feast of flesh. We're in sort of the holiday trifecta right now, right in the middle of it, starting off with Halloween, which I realize isn't a traditional holiday, but people act like it is. And as much money as Americans spend on Halloween, it might as well be a day off for your average American.
Yep.
We're approaching Thanksgiving. And it's sort of Thanksgiving is a time when it's a time of feast. It's when you've been working all year, on your crops, and this is a time to celebrate and enjoy them before everybody hibernates for 3 months. Because you and I live in the Northeast, and winter is actually upon us right now. It came a little early this year. 2 weeks ago, it was like 80 degrees here, and now there's snow. It's just kind of weird. But I wanted to talk about sort of humans as food, and that involves, of course, a lot of cannibalism in films. But sometimes, it's not always man eating man. It could be a predator of man's, such as an alligator or something like that. So there's quite a bit to talk about in the subject, and we're going to touch upon three of my favorite horror directors. The first one is Herschel Gordon Lewis. We're going to talk about Tobe Hooper, who was really influential when I was a kid, going to the theater watching movies. And then right after Tobe Hooper, Wes Craven, somebody whose movies that I fell in love with also, when I was a teenager or so, and still like them. All three of them are sort of larger than life figures in a way, particularly Herschel Gordon Lewis, who seemed to be more of a character than anything he ever put on screen. If he had just
many stories over the years.
If he had just aimed the camera at himself, he would have been a star. He used to be an English professor, and as somebody who teaches in college, I can attest that there is a bit of a ham in a lot of us who do teach, whether that's in college or in some other venue. And I understand Athena is going to be back.
Yes, she started teaching young kids, and we've been working with different educational companies, and that's how this started. And we did a science class in one of the schools, and they fell in love with Athena, and they wanted to hire her right away. So now she's going through that. She started working part-time there, and she's going through all the processes of becoming a teacher in New Jersey. So I'm very happy for her. Excuse me, I'm very happy for her. She's always liked doing teaching, so now she gets to do it more, and I'm really overjoyed.
Well, she seemed to be incredibly excited about it, so I could tell it was something that she really wanted to do. And it seems to be giving her a new direction.
Yes.
And for me, we're going to talk about some of my old direction. Like I said, three of my favorite horror film directors, and I've got a bunch. And I've also got an interesting tale to tell in the middle of all of it about an Italian film that stars an American actor who made more than 200 movies during the course of his career. Yes. And it's an interesting tale, but let's go ahead and jump into Herschel Gordon Lewis. Obviously, Blood Feast is the film I'm going to talk about here with this topic, and this is man-eating man for the most part. It centers around the antagonist. His name is Fuad Ramses, and he's a caterer in Miami. And all of this is shot in Miami. It all takes place in Miami. And there's only one professional actor in the entire film. His name is William Kerwin. And he was a pro. He did a lot of movies. He did a lot of television shows. You would see him pop up in secondary roles in movies and TV shows until he passed away in the late 1980s. He was in several Herschel Gordon Lewis's movies over the years. Herschel Gordon Lewis actually started out as an English professor, and he also worked in radio quite a bit in the 1950s. And I think he taught at Mississippi. Wait a minute, I'm having an issue here. Okay, but I think he taught in Mississippi for a while. Wound up in Chicago, and in some way, shape, or form, started directing industrial films, kind of like Herc Harvey, who did Carnival of Souls. Started out in industrial films, and you learn the techniques, you learn how to edit, and you also learn how to do things on a really strict, tight budget, which is fantastic for B movie makers. And Herschel Gordon Lewis was that director. He made Blood Feast for less than $25,000. That's not much money in 1960, even in 1963, to put an entire film in the can. And one like this, which is really, it's shocking for today. You know, we're coming into 2023 here in about what, 6 weeks. This movie came out in 1963, so that makes it about 60 years old. It's very gruesome, bloody. There's some shots that are kind of painful to watch. I guess its saving grace is that the acting in it isn't stellar. William Kerwin does a nice job. His soon-to-be wife is in it as well. She was a Playboy Playmate for 1963. Her name is Connie Mason. Beautiful woman, not the world's best actress, but she has screen presence. I mean, I'll give her that. And she does seem to improve through the movie. So I guess she was just getting her feet wet. And she's also in one of my top 10 favorite movies, as is William Kerwin, which is 2000 Maniacs. It's another Herschel Gordon Lewis film. Now, that's a pretty gruesome film too, but I don't recall anybody getting eaten, even though there is a barbecue scene where that could possibly occur. But in Blood Feast, I sort of took the long way around to get to the topic of the plot, that is. In Blood Feast, it centers on a caterer in Miami. His name is Fuad Ramses, and he likes to cater Egyptian feasts and seems to cater to a clientele in Miami of students who take night classes on ancient Egyptian culture.
That makes sense.
Yeah, there's some plot holes that you could drive a bus through in this movie. But it's one of the world's first real slasher films. Very gory, very graphic. And the movie was banned here and there, in areas that had really strict mores. The United Kingdom used to ban all kinds of films like these in the 60s. They had a list of 72 films that folks in Britain weren't allowed to watch, essentially. Movies like this were among and if you tell me that I'm not emotionally equipped to watch a film, the first thing I'm going to do is to go out and watch that movie, especially as a child. So these films were immensely popular. They cost nothing to produce. They earned big money because they were so shocking, they were so appalling for the time, that people lined up at the drive-in to go see them. And this movie was incredibly successful, especially if you look at the budget. It played largely in southern drive-ins and in grindhouses, in big cities. And I love both. I got to tell you, going to the drive-in as a kid was always fun. But when I was a teenager, I used to go to this grindhouse a lot in the town that I lived in at the time. And It was incredibly cheap. I think you got in for $1 or something like that. You got a double feature. They were usually horror films. I saw some great horror movies there, a couple of which I'm about to talk about, to tell you the truth. But Herschel Gordon Lewis's movies are I'm a huge fan of them. None of them have any kind of a budget. He went from making industrial films into making nudies, which is what they were called at the time.
Mhm.
Um, filmmakers at the time were allowed to shoot nudity unless you were doing like porn or something like that. And that wasn't allowed. But you were allowed to show nudity as long as it took place within the confines of a nudist camp.
Yes.
Then it was anthropological. It was anthropology. It wasn't lewd and lascivious, I suppose. So they did movies like that. One of Greg's favorite movies is a Doris Wishman movie called Blaze Starr Goes Nudist, and it was shot in a
Yes.
nudist camp. And the whole reason that Blaze is in the nudist camp is so that Doris Wishman, who was the director, could point the camera at her breasts and have them exposed, and audiences could go legitimately see it without being too embarrassed, I guess.
Well, during the Renaissance, they painted the ancient Greek mythological scenes with nudity because it was okay for Greek mythological figures to be naked, and some people have hypothesized that that's why classical art and classical literature took off again during the Renaissance, because it was the only place you can go to watch and read about naked people doing things that naked people do, and still be literate.
Well, it's I don't want to digress too much, but the mores in this country then and now are just insane. We're not ashamed of the things that we should be ashamed of. Let's try that.
Okay.
But anyway, Herschel Gordon Lewis and his producer partner, who was David F. Friedman, started out doing some nudies, and they were moderately successful. But the nudie genre was really short. It lasted maybe, oh gosh, just a few years, late 50s into the mid 60s. And that's because, the Motion Picture Association, trotted out in 1968. They trotted out, their gradations of disgust, in terms of movies. You had movies for general audiences, movies that children could see with parental guidance, and there was R, then there was X. And those movies kind of really chipped away at the exploitation market. They changed. I should say they changed the exploitation market. The one thing that B movie actors have to do is they have to stay one step ahead of the B movie directors, I should say, not actors. They have to stay one step ahead of big pictures. They've got to be more shocking. They've got to be a little more explicit. They've got to be more daring. You don't have any money, so you've got to give the audience something, and you can't give them the same thing that they're getting in these A pictures. You've got to hand them something. And some B movie directors were really good at it, and Herschel Gordon Lewis was. He was good at filming gore. The movies that he shot have this sort of Elvis Technicolor about them. The color is very vivid. I've got his works on Something Weird DVDs that I bought like 20 years ago, when they came out. And the transfer is gorgeous. The copies are really good. The transfer to DVD is wonderful. The colors are bright and vivid, and they pop. It's almost like the non-sepia parts of The Wizard of Oz. I mean, it's just so bright and vivid, and it makes the blood look that much redder. I guess might be the way to go with that. He used a lot of stage blood, and I think you had to buy a gallon of it at a time, and he was going to use it all, I suppose. But it really kicked off a genre for him. And there's sort of a trilogy when it comes to these movies. Blood Feast is the first one. The second one is one of my all-time favorite movies, as I mentioned, 2000 Maniacs. And then the final film is called Color Me Blood Red. All three are really fantastic to watch. Again, Blood Feast is wonderful, and I like the original, but 2000 Maniacs is my sentimental favorite for a number of reasons. I first became familiar with Herschel Gordon Lewis's movies. Oh gosh, I was a teenager. I had just gotten a VCR. I was probably 16, 17 years old, and places where you could rent videotapes were popping up, you know, and videotapes were so expensive at the time. If you
Yes.
anything that was created by that was manufactured was $200. I mean, you know, just an insane amount of money. And even to buy a blank tape, I think was $5 to $10, depending on the quality. And with videotapes, better quality was the way to go because those tapes would last. I have some videotapes that are 40 years old that still work, which is amazing because they're so analog. You, in a sense, you know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
But some of Herschel Gordon Lewis's horror films were pretty early to hit the VHS market, and I started renting them because the covers were lurid and looked kind of terrifying, you know. And so watched the movies and was just kind of blown away by them. And kind of amazed that something at the time, which was, you know, close to 20 years old, was that graphic. And looking back at it now that it's 60 years old, it's amazing that it's that graphic. I can see why you know, some areas wanted to ban it just because it was so unlike anything that had ever played at their, you know, local theater in the past. I'm not saying it's right to ban it, but I can see why it might have been a shock to some people's systems because it is graphic. Now, there's no nudity or anything like that in it, even though you know, Lewis and Friedman had shot nudies. Well, I think there is a breast in Blood Feast now that I think about it, but I mean, it's not the point of the shot or anything like that. It just, I think it's more just happens to be there more than anything else. I think the blood is there for titillation's sake, but not nudity or anything like that. Now, 2000 Maniacs, like I said, I think it's brilliant. I have an inherent fear, even though I live in West Virginia, I have an inherent fear of sort of small town America. So, I live in a college town, but I do. I've actually wandered off the, you know, the main road in the past, such as the 4 or 6 main characters in 2000 Maniacs do. And have gotten into situations dealing with locals that have been kind of creepy and scary. Not as creepy and scary as they're portrayed in 2000 Maniacs. I mean, nobody ever tried to, you know, kidnap me, drag me into their town to have a celebration, and then try to kill me. But it feels that way sometimes. Anyway, like I have, there's so much admiration that I have for Herschel Gordon Lewis. He had some bad things happen to him in life. He had to go to prison in the 1970s. He was only there for, I think, maybe a year or two, but he got caught with his hand in the till. And, you know, fraud is never a nice thing to do. But he started direct marketing afterward and became as successful in that as he was as a low budget horror film director, and an extremely colorful man. As I mentioned before we went on tonight, if he had only pointed the camera at himself, that would have been the most interesting film he ever shot. Because, you know, he was such a huge character, better than anything that he ever put on film. And it's a shame that you didn't get to see a little bit more of that side of him. I mean, he'll do a cameo. He did a cameo here and there, especially in some of the in some newer horror films. But, you know, he was really inspired, you know, back in the day, and turned out some really graphic, groundbreaking horror films. made for nothing and starring no one. So what else? That's sort of my tribute to Herschel Gordon Lewis. I love his movies. I've got a bunch of them. Uh, you know, I of the Blood trilogy, 2000 Maniacs is my favorite, but my favorite film of his is called Something Weird. It's this psychological thriller. It was made in the late 1960s, and there's no blood, there's nothing bloody about it. It's just a no budget thriller. And it's a really fun movie to watch, and I don't think it gets enough love, honestly.
Maybe because it doesn't have the normal gore elements that he is known for.
Not at all. It's much more cerebral. And if he'd had like 10 times the budget that he obviously had for it, it would have been a fantastic movie if he could have hired better writers, better actors. But he did pretty well with what he had. And it seems to be that if you want to make money in a low budget film, horror is really the way to go. Science fiction can be kind of expensive. If you have to have props for science fiction, and props cost money. All you really need in a horror film is a deranged lunatic or a set of fangs. You don't need a whole lot of props, to be menacing. A lot of that can be conveyed through the eyes, if nothing else.
Well, back in the day when we were in Pennsylvania, because I'd made a movie and it was shown locally, theatrically, it was shown on cable TV, and it was shown, locally in theaters. So we were thinking of making a bunch of low budget horror movies. And the budget was, of course, the most important thing, but you would be surprised if you just talk to people who know you, what they have access to. Like one film that never got made because it fell through, but I had access to tanks and realistic style weapons and jeeps, that these people had access to that were retired from service. And they just had them sitting in collections and in like exhibit type of places, and they're willing to let me use them in exchange for like a cameo in the movie or like a movie credit or stuff like that. So if you're really creative and you're not afraid to talk to people and to and before you know it, you have tons of things to choose from. So you have like several locations you can choose from, a bunch of artifacts you can choose from, and then it becomes like you said, okay, who's the bad guy, who are the good guys, what are the twists along the way, how can we use these sets to tell the story. And the simplest, of course, if you had access to a house or a couple of houses and woods, those are the easiest ones to put together stories for.
Especially something you can damage, freely. Yeah. Now that's prime for a horror film. If you could damage the house, and that's what happened in George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. He found a house that was going to be torn down, so they could do what they wanted to do with it. And right after filming subsided, that house was torn down. There's flesh. I specifically excluded Night of the Living Dead because it's clearly also one of my top 10 favorite films, and I talk about it too much, so I didn't go that route. Although that's exactly, when they pull Barbara out of the house through the boarded up windows, actually her brother is one of them, she gets eaten. But because there's so many of the zombies there. And that's kind of where I'm going now. We're transitioning over into zombie territory. But like I said, I did exclude Night of the Living Dead because I do talk about it entirely too much. A movie that I don't talk about too much is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Classic.
Which I saw it in a grindhouse. I was, I don't know, 11, 12. It hadn't just come out. It had been out for a little while because it was the second feature. I can't remember what film the first feature was, but it was a horror film. And if you stuck around Saturday afternoon for a while, you got to see the second feature. And it was the second feature and blew my little mind. I had never quite seen anything like that. I hadn't seen the Herschel Gordon Lewis films yet because um, videotape was the home video market, I should say, was in its infancy. And the only way you could see things like that were in theaters at the time. And I do remember vividly seeing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because the grindhouse that I saw it in was actually, I want to say, a third to a half full. There were a number of people there, and I guess none of us had seen it because we all gasped and laughed in the same places in the film. The film's pretty gory. It's cheap, but it's well done. It was directed by Tobe Hooper. It was sort of a groundbreaking film for him. And Tobe Hooper did so many bigger pictures later on. Poltergeist. He did the remake of Invaders from Mars. He did The Funhouse, which I think is a really great, underrated early 1980s horror film. I think it came out in 81 and really worth seeing. Salem's Lot, which I've heard so many people say that Salem's Lot was the scariest thing they ever saw that was made for television. And it is terrifying. I can remember seeing it as a teenager, and it'd have the lights turned off, and I think it was on CBS. It was really creepy. And he did another movie that I'm going to talk about in a bit called Eaten Alive, which Neville Brand is in it and just chews on the scenery. It's so campy. He does a great job. Neville Brand was so good at being creepy and like westerns and everything he was in. He's always shady and up to no good, but in horror films, he really is able to transcend all of that and just takes it, another notch, upward, and doesn't worry about how ridiculous he might look, and he shouldn't, because he turns in an amazing performance in that movie. It is so cool. It's got a great cast. He's not the only one, and it's so satisfying when a horror director is able to put really talented people in his films. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre does have some people in it who are talented. Marilyn Burns is the big name in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. She did other horror films on in the 70s. Sadly passed away a number of years ago. Young, too. She wasn't that old when she passed, just in her 50s, but was in some really good movies. And it's another film where people are traveling and they kind of stumble into this rural area where atrocious things happen. And that, I think this is really why I have a fear of rural America. I saw movies like this when I was a kid, and they all involve city folks coming to the country and getting killed and eaten in this case. I don't want to throw out any spoilers for people who haven't seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think it's a great film. The end of it at once lets it down and yet makes the movie at the same time, if that probably makes no sense.
No, that makes sense.
The end of the people in that grindhouse, and like I said, I can still remember it, were screaming, in certain episodes where the kitchen is, and Marilyn Burns is trying to get away from Leatherface. People were really tense and screaming. And then when she does get away and flags the truck down, the tempo of it's just wrong, and people started laughing because it just wasn't the best way to end it. But now that I think about it, maybe it was the best way to end it, because I still remember how it ended, and that's not the case for a lot of films.
Many films, yeah.
And so many of these movies are based on the same story about an American cannibal, serial killer who was a cannibal, Ed Gein. So many movies have been based on his story, and that's one of them. Although the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not a badly made film. And John Larroquette from Night Court does the narration for it. Apparently, he was paid in pot to do the
Really?
narration, which and I think that was his own admission, so I find that kind of interesting. um, and some of the actors in it, like I said, Marilyn Burns, great exploitation and horror film actress, did some other movies of a decent quality. Another one for Tobe Hooper, actually. She did Eaten Alive, which I alluded to just a few minutes ago. But Eaten Alive, Tobe Hooper had another couple of years and got more money together. And typically, if you know how to do things on a tight budget and you're given a little more money, you can usually make that stretch.
Right.
And he did with this one. He got, like I said, Neville Brand is just amazing in this film, just creepy as hell. Carolyn Jones, fantastic character, great performance, over the top, but it's a horror film, so why not? Mel Ferrer is in it. Marilyn Burns is in the film as well. Robert Englund from Nightmare on Elm Street. He's sort of the common thread in a lot of 70s and 80s horror films. He's the liaison or the link between Tobe Hooper and Wes Craven, although there are other links as well. Stuart Whitman is in it, great character actor. He could be protagonist, antagonist, somewhere in between. He was very comfortable doing any of it. He would big roles, small parts. He didn't care as long as he was working, and wound up to be a wealthy man because he did have a decent work ethic and was realistic about growing older in an industry where youth is prized. As we were talking just a few minutes ago, right before we started, and Roberta Collins is in this movie. Beautiful blonde actress from the 70s in one of my favorite films, Death Race 2000. She's Matilda the Hun in Death Race 2000. And just fabulous actress. There again, another one we lost too soon. Did some really brilliant low budget films and brilliant work in those films. But like I said, Eaten Alive has a great plot. Neville Brand and his creepy family own a motel, and they've got a pet. Well, they have an alligator in the back, and the alligator's got to eat. So unsuspecting tourists, beware. And there again, like I said, my fear of rural America. I'm going to say that I have Tobe Hooper and Herschel Gordon Lewis to thank for that.
As you're describing the places in America that you've been to and comparing the reality to what you find in movies, that would make a great travel book. Brian's Drive-In Theater Guide to Southern America.
Places that have creeped me out.
There you go. I think that would be a bestseller.
I've got a few stories. I could fill the book too. I've got a few stories to tell. Something happened to us in South Carolina back in the 1990s that I never really have fully processed. It was creepy. We won't go there right now.
Okay.
I
don't know that.
There are parts of South Carolina that are fine. I've been to Hilton Head a number of times. It's okay. Greenville is a very pleasant town in South Carolina, but the place that we stopped in, woo. It was almost as if Rod Serling was narrating our whole visit to it. And I think my cat Tippy is behind me. Yes, she is. There she is.
There she is.
Yeah, she's a ham too, aren't you, sweetheart? Anyway, we've talked about this movie a few months ago when we talked about vacation horror, so I won't touch on it too much. But The Hills Have Eyes. The hillbillies who descend from the hills, they're cannibals. So, and that's a fantastic film. It's so well done, and it's another Tobe Hooper film. And just as creepy as all get out. Michael Berryman, that's sort of the movie that everybody knows him from. And Dee Wallace, who has a great horror reputation. She's done a lot of horror films over the years. It's an earlier horror film for her. She's known for a number of films over the years in that genre. But this is one of her earlier ones, and a lot of fun. And Virginia Vincent, who was a character actress like in the 40s, did a lot of television work in the 50s and 60s, and she's in this as the mom. And it involves a family. They're on their way to California. They're towing a travel trailer, and the gas station attendant, because they're out in the desert somewhere, the gas station attendant warns them from straying away from the main road. And of course, Dad is a stubborn idiot and immediately veers away from the main road, and then all hell breaks loose with the hillbillies. And I realize I said that Tobe Hooper directed that. That is not true. That's actually Wes Craven. But Wes Craven was inspired by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and that's where some of the imagery from The Hills Have Eyes comes from. And I'm a big Wes Craven fan too.
I've read interviews by some directors of B movies, some of which I saw and I've never seen again, anywhere. But some of the directors said that they would watch these classic horror movies and then they try to beat what happened. The scenes that everybody loved, they try to create a scene that was different and better or more shocking than the scene that was in the movie. And that's how they put their movies together. It's like they take something like The Hills Have Eyes, and how can we give them something creepy or something better in this scene? And the story would be loosely similar, and it was an interesting way to make movies.
Well, and we're always influenced by what we've loved and what we've seen. Whether we're neurotically embracing it or immediately rejecting it, we're affected by it.
Right.
And it does have some sort of impact. I tend to like love letters more when it comes to directing. I like it when you can see who has influenced a particular because that means that this particular director loved this influence, and that also means that's a director whose work you really need to pay attention to. Go back and look at it and see what it was that inspired this later person to do whatever the later person had done. And there's so many horror directors that you can. Brian De Palma, I think he was clearly affected by a number of Alfred Hitchcock films and his reactions to them. But he also does really good mystery, as well. He's very adept at that. And there's a really fine line between mystery and horror. And in the 1940s, you saw that line blurred often in films. There's some film noir movies out there, especially in the 40s, that sort of dip a toe into horror. And it's it's an intriguing combination that works really well because horror films are often mysteries. I mean, who is doing what, why? It's the same. It's the same impetus. The next film I wanted to talk about, I love Italian movies, and Italian horror films are the most violent of the bunch. Way more violent than American horror films. More violent than German horror, British, you name it. Italian films really take the cake. And that's why I like them so much. They are over the top. They did some cannibal movies in the late 70s and early 80s. The one I want to talk about is called Cannibal Holocaust, which is ridiculously violent. If you are affected by violence on screen, this is not going to be the film you want to watch because it is very graphic. And the most interesting thing about it is its star. It's an Italian film, but it stars an American actor. His name was Robert Kerman. Grew up in New York, Wanted to be an actor from a young age, went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, got a degree in acting, and did a lot of good work off Broadway. Was a very good actor, but just couldn't put anything together. Couldn't get a film role. Nothing panned out for him, even though he was a good actor. Well, I mean, he wasn't ugly or anything like that, but he wasn't the handsomest guy either. Just sort of average looking, and just never got anywhere. He wound up doing non-sexual roles in porno films in the 70s because he could act. He could also coach people on how to act. And I guess this is when pornography actually had plot lines and,
Loose plot lines.
and protagonists and antagonists. They followed the basic format of straight films. It was all the same. There was just like sex interjected. And I guess you had to learn lines. You had to hit your marks. You had to be prepared. And then you had to have sex. That seems like a lot of responsibility on the part of the actors, if you think about it. So you have to learn lines and you have to have sex. It's a lot to go through. But in this film, he crossed the line over into actually the sexual parts in 1970s and 1980s horror films. It was originally he called himself Richard Bola, but he shortened that to just an initial R. It was R. Bola. If you look up his filmography, he's in more than 200 porn films. I mean, wow. He's just a lot. And I realize, from what I understand, that's kind of normal for foreign actors from once upon a time. When they were grinding these movies out in the 70s and 80s, they seemed to largely star like the same 15, 20 people, same people over and over, probably the same production companies and such.
Well, these people are reliable and responsible. I found when I had my show, and again, it was a dinky little fringe show, that I'd much rather have people who were okay, but reliable than have divas who wouldn't show up, or they come in drunk or high, and there was always drama and all sorts of antagonistic interactions with other people and not listening to the director. And so again, I learned on my reliables, and I did mostly everything with the reliables, and everything was fine.
Well, and you're right. You have to have people that you can count on, because time is money. And when you're trying to put a film together, you don't want somebody constantly blowing lines, because that makes the production longer. Right. And it also costs you a lot of money if it makes the production longer. You want people who can recite their lines on cue, hit their marks, and not screw things up. And if somebody else starts screwing things up, people who can jump in and kind of route the conversation back into the script and kind of save the day. And he was one of those actors. They're again a very good actor, Robert Kerman, otherwise known as Richard Bola, and did straight films and porn at the same time. And he was in Debbie Does Dallas in 1979, and Cannibal Holocaust came out in 1980. So he went literally from one film to the other. I mean, it's just kind of amazing that he was doing both at the same time. Now, whenever he would be found out, he would usually lose his representation, and this happened to him several times. And he really seemed to desperately want to be a, straight up actor doing character roles. But for whatever reason, I guess it was the money. You kept doing, pornography, porn films. He eventually quit all of it in the late 1980s and came back and did a few regular movies. But he died several years ago. He had a bad case of diabetes, and never married, never had kids. It's kind of a cautionary tale in a way.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know that he he might have had it. He might have been very happy. Who knows? But it doesn't sound like his career went the way he wanted it to. And like I said, just it's an interesting story about the film. Now there have been other actors in 70s and 80s porn who went on to do a lot of horror, B movies, horror films. Marilyn Chambers is in Rabid, a movie that I saw, oh gosh, when I was a teenager, and a very graphic horror film, and she's great in it.
Tracy Lord was also in a bunch of horror movies, if I remember correctly.
She was. Now, the pornography that she made, as I recall, she actually, most of it was shot before she was legally an adult.
Yes, I remember that.
And nobody can watch that now. But yeah, she did. Just because you're in porn doesn't mean that you're a bad actor. Some of those people actually could act. I don't know about now. I don't know who porn stars are now. But back then, they were fairly close to being celebrities. You would see them in pictures trying to get into Studio 54 along with people who were in A pictures, and I think some of those people did have enough notoriety to be somebody for a while. And they might not have made any money, but they were known.
Like Ron Jeremy and John Holmes, they were known in mainstream. People knew who they
yes.
were.
Yes. It wasn't Ron Jeremy, I guess. Well, I think he's in a lot of trouble now, as I recall. But is still alive. Still with us. I think he had a heart problem or something like that a few years ago. And he's somebody else who's done lots of roles, not always in porn. He did a lot of B movies. And like you said, somebody that like almost everyone knows. And he has about as good of name recognition as any A actor, at this point. Now, I realize that sometimes notoriety doesn't get you a lot of money,
right?
but some people I don't think care as much about the money as they do about being famous.
And at that point, we're past the 10 o'clock mark. Do you have time, or do you need to go today?
Pardon me?
Do you have a little bit more time, or do you need to go?
No, I have a little bit more time.
Okay, well, we'll wrap up then. But I'd like to see where we're going. I thought you were going to mention like Ravenous and Cannibal. No, you did mention Cannibal Holocaust. Cannibal the Musical, which was... And also a movie I keep bringing up, Psychos in Love. That has cannibalism, gourmet cannibalism in it.
It does. Actually, to tell you the truth, with Herschel Gordon Lewis, Toby Hooper, and Wes Craven, I thought, gosh, there's an hour right there.
Yes.
So I had to edit things. And that I even left out George Romero, which is I've talked about Romero's film so much that I wanted to try to get away from that and talk about something else. I did want to mention The Hills Have Eyes 2 for a moment.
Okay.
It was a film that Wes Craven didn't really want to do, but got in a position where he had to do it. And everybody's got to eat. And I think they got more than half of the film in the can. They'd done a lot of shooting, but then the budget just sort of gave way, and there was no more money to make the picture. So production ceased on The Hills Have Eyes 2. And the original film, The Hills Have Eyes, was a hit. Didn't cost much to make, made a whole lot of money, that is. If you compared its proceeds to its production costs. Well, Wes Craven was then did A Nightmare on Elm Street, which was a huge hit in 1984 when it came out. That was the big movie that year. Well, I should say one of the big movies. I think Ghostbusters was really popular, but A Nightmare on Elm Street was very influential, extremely popular for a horror film, and a big box office success. So the studio convinced Wes Craven to go back and finish the movie that the budget had collapsed on, which was The Hills Have Eyes too. But they only gave him enough to really use what had already been shot. They didn't have enough money to go back in and shoot any new scenes, so they cut in some scenes from the old film. And Wes Craven disowned the film after a while because it's not horrible, but it's not the greatest film, and it's certainly not as good as the original. And finally, I wanted to wrap this up with where we were headed all along, which was Silence of the Lambs. Such a fantastic film, a film that I saw in the theater more than 30 years ago, still holds up, still just deeply disturbing on so many different levels. The first time I saw this in the theater, I kind of felt dirty, I mean physically dirty, especially with Ted Levine's character as James Gumb. I mean, just a fantastic performance, by the way. Creepy as all get out. I mean, the hair's standing on the back of my neck right now, just thinking about it. Really good actor. He used to be on Monk, which is a really fun detective show too, and in a very straight character kind of role. To see that, if you didn't know that he'd been in The Silence of the Lambs, you just never guess. But
As Buffalo Bill. Yeah.
Yes, and creepy as all get out. Now, Buffalo Bill, as far as we know, doesn't eat his victims. He just uses their hide, essentially, to make a costume for himself, so to speak. The real cannibal is Hannibal Lecter, who's portrayed by Anthony Hopkins. And Jodie Foster is a young woman from West Virginia. We're not really sure where in the state, and I'm not sure where that she's supposed to be from. But she's very bright, very young, and is determined to catch the serial killer, who is Ted Levine's character, but needs the help of another serial killer, which is Hannibal Lecter, in order to catch Ted Levine. And the byplay between Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins is just amazing to watch. I really don't know much about the production of it. I don't know how they shot it, but it's very intense. And at once, their interactions are adversarial yet friendly. It's a really weird dichotomy, and it makes for just an excellent film. Now this is a good example of horror that if you have an unlimited budget or at least a lot more money, horror movies can be top notch.
Right.
Fantastic acting, great sets, camera work and such. You can do horror films on a budget, make them look good, but if more money's the better. You can usually make them look even better if you've got more. However, I kind of like the inventiveness of only having $25,000 to shoot your gory blood feast film, and you, especially somebody like Herschel Gordon Lewis, who had 9 days to shoot a film in Miami, and doing it with people who weren't pros had to have been tough. Combing community theaters to get people to recite and read lines and look into a camera, that had to have been very difficult. And to get that movie made in 9 days, I mean, I think Herschel Gordon Lewis was a magician.
And they left us a legacy of these interesting explorations of the human condition, and we're still talking about them many years later.
And what's so interesting about it is they spent so little time in the actual production process. I'm sure pre-production, there's a lot of work to be done in pre-production. Yes. Lining everything up is tough, but to only spend like a week and a half on something that's going to follow you around for the rest of your life, oh boy. I'm sure that anytime I don't know how often or if ever you ever watched his films. But to go back and look at them, you would think, you know, gosh, if we just had another $500, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh. I know exactly what you mean.
You'd second guess yourself for the rest of your life. That must be tough. Put you under a lot of pressure. Of course, you're not thinking about how the movie's going to be perceived in 50 years. You're thinking about, you know, gosh, is anybody ever going to book this picture?
Yep. But again, it's surprising. I think I shared with you when we were looking for homes in Pennsylvania like 2 decades ago. We actually visited some homes where the people recognized me and they'd seen my TV show or my movie, and I was like, I was really surprised that they'd seen either. But nonetheless, and when we settled in Honesdale too, I'd occasionally encounter people who were fans of the show and or who'd seen the movie. So these things get watched, and someplace my original copies got destroyed in the flood. I've kept them and dried them out just in case they could be salvaged.
Mhm.
But who knows? Somebody might have them recorded somewhere and I'll eventually stumble across it. And it was always my intent to put those out. But again, we'll see what happens.
Well, hopefully somebody did record them for the sake of posterity.
And that will be my quest, to find those people or that person.
Put out a call on social media. It is the best way. You'd be surprised the things you'll find out.
Brian, you're awesome.
Oh,
And
thank
this show was awesome. I apologize. I have a cold, so I'm having a difficult time today. But you took me again a stroll down memory lane. I've seen all these movies, and I started remembering bits and pieces of them, and I'm grateful for that. I want to wish you, Greg, your mom, and everybody that is in your circle a very happy Thanksgiving. It's coming up next week, and I'm looking forward to our next show together, which will be in a few weeks.
Well, thank you so much, Hercules, and I hope you and Athena and your family have a wonderful Thanksgiving as well.
Thank you very much. And now if I could figure out the correct button to press,
Bye.
I will say goodbye. They seem to have changed the buttons again, so I'll just end the meeting and that'll take care of it.
Okay.
Be well, my friend. Talk to you soon.
Good night, Hercules.
This will be on the YouTube in a couple of days.
Mm.